Hello and welcome to another episode of Essential Implementation. Now, this is a Recoil. It's what's known as a patient-reported outcome measure, and it can be used by clinicians and patients to track patients' well-being quality of life over time. The questionnaire is relatively straightforward. There are 10 questions on quality of life. You choose how often, sometimes often, most of the time, etc. You go through the 10 questions, and at the end, you'll get a visualization and an overall score. And the visualization will show you basically which areas of your life are high in quality and which areas are low, such as activity, belonging, choice, self-perception. So in this podcast, I'll be speaking to Dr. Elizabeth Taylor Buck and Amanda Lane, who have both been responsible for rolling out Recoil across the NHS. You'd think it would be quite easy to implement something like this, but implementing patient-reported outcome measures are notoriously difficult. As you will see in this podcast, it takes a long time and there are many barriers. After a lot of work, Lizzie and Amanda have been able to ensure that now 80% of NHS trusts have a license for Recoil. So I started off by asking both Lizzie and Amanda, how did they manage to implement it? So over to you guys. How did you manage to achieve this over 4 years? How did you manage to roll Recoil out and get it in 80% of trusts?
I think in a way, we were helped by the quality of the measure itself. So it was developed with by a scientific group that using a really robust methodology. So in terms of kind of knowing that we were offering people a robust tool, we had that advantage. But I think even more than that, there was the advantage of all the service user input and all the input from clinicians that we'd had over the development of Recoil, which meant that it had a really high face validity from the start with service users and clinicians. And people knew that it was addressing the issues that were important to service users. We also had some really kind of visionary people about how we would launch it. We launched it at the Houses of Parliament. And we presented the research side first, but then in the afternoon we had a stakeholder workshop, and that kind of kicked off the implementation in a really helpful way. And that was something that later on myself and Amanda were able to build on and to set up further stakeholder events to really engage the clinicians, the managers, the commissioners that would be using Recoil. So we kind of right from the start took it out of the academic arena and into the clinical arena, and that was always on the agenda.
So that's really fascinating, because we know from implementation science, some of the academic kind of knowledge, the frameworks, that having a strong evidence base is associated with more successful implementation, which you had. But you also developed it with people, clinicians, service users, and then had this approach of taking it to the Houses of Parliament to launch it. So I suppose what would be interesting is to know how, I suppose, are you sort of the missing part of that? Is actually the relationships that you built, the you sort of approaching people and actually making those things happen.
I think it was an example of one of those things we always write into our research bids, that we will use the scientific group, we will use the advisory group to help with the knowledge transfer, the knowledge mobilization. So the thing about Recoil is, because it had been so robustly tested, we had trusts around the country that had been involved in the piloting of it, in the testing phases. So, and we had this really strong service user group that were feeding in to the scientific and advisory groups. So we already had our stakeholders there to invite to the event. We had all the trusts that had piloted it for us. We had all the people in our scientific and advisory groups. So yes, we kind of, the research process created a quite a wide and active stakeholder group from the start.
Yeah, somebody once said to me, if you want people to implement something well, make it their own.
Involve them in the research, and that's what we did.
Right, and that's clearly turned out very well in terms of how well you've implemented it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're going to come on to the challenges. One of the challenges is the churn. So whilst we might have had certain people that were committed to the piloting stage and the testing stage, and then they might have come to the Westminster group, probably by the time 2 years later, Amanda and I ran the second stakeholder event, a lot of those people had moved on, had different roles. And so it was about then sort of getting a foot in the organisation, but finding out who had taken over the Recoil role, because again, the people that would be involved with the research, like testing the measure, would not necessarily be the same people that would be involved with implementing it. So there was it wasn't a straightforward transfer.
No. So were you, for the last 4 years, and Amanda, for you, the last 2.5 years, has it involved a kind of an ongoing ringing people and maintaining those relationships and letting and checking things? How have you kept up those relationships? How have you created the relationships with the people that are implementing?
I think one of the key things when I joined and working with Lizzie to support the implementation was, obviously Lizzie had done a great deal of work individually with NHS trusts. But one of the things that we kept going back to was the fact that we'd had this launch at Westminster, and as Lizzie said, we needed to re-engage some people, but also we needed to get on board people that wanted to engage with Recoil, but not necessarily maybe had the time, or maybe they weren't necessarily in that position at that point. So we've done quite a lot on promoting Recoil, but not in a marketing sense. It's been all about how can we look at best practice, how can we share the knowledge and the skills and the expertise, but do it in a very collegiate way. So it's not about us saying, oh, well, this is what we've done. It's always been about what's worked for clinicians and what's worked with patients. And so we've set about doing a series of workshops and conferences and seminars where we've got groups of clinicians together.
Yeah, I think probably the emphasis shifted. So I think obviously we had the stakeholder event on the launch in 16, and then I think I probably spent the next year and a half kind of doing what you're suggesting, Christian, sort of going to trusts, sometimes going into just a single Teams meeting, sometimes going into a higher level strategic meeting, sometimes going to a research day, sometimes going to a conference. So there was a certain amount of kind of being a bit of a traveling salesman and kind of knocking on doors, and anybody that showed interest, I'd go over, I'd do my presentation. We put a version of the presentation I was giving on our website as a little kind of podcast, so that other people that I didn't visit could still present what is Recoil. So I think there was a certain amount of kind of really actively trying to create this community of practice. And then our second event was really about inviting all those people that I'd engaged with over 18 months and saying, do you want this to be more formal? Do you want this to be a community of practice that involves service users, clinicians? And the answer was yes, that we do. And we also at that event did some priority setting. So what would you want the community of practice to do? What is the, what are the priorities? And we have tried very hard to act on those priorities.
Yes. Yeah. So if somebody wanted to roll something out, they would probably be quite wise to ask you two or somebody with the same approach to actually do what you've done. It sounds like
I could learn from our mistakes as well as our successes.
Yes, oh, of course, but it's a far cry from the original way of doing things, which was to create something like Recoil, put it in a journal, and then leave it to hospitals to implement. Which we know doesn't work. So let me ask you this: what do you think would happen to Recoil if you two had to move on?
Right now, I think we would be leaving it in a good state. So it's been included in the National Mental Health Dataset, and as such, use of it is part of the national sequin. So and that's just in the UK. Internationally, it's part of the ICHOM, the International Consortium for Health Outcome Measures. So I think in some ways it would continue to be used because there would be with sequin, there would be financial benefits for using it. However, the risk is that it becomes used in a tick box fashion, and that we've always promoted Recoil as having being useful both for collecting data, but also as part of making services more recovery oriented, and keeping the focus on what matters to service users. And I think that potentially, whilst that would probably flourish in certain trusts, without a doubt it would, that learning wouldn't be shared. So you'd get pockets of good practice rather than a kind of rolling improvement nationally, I imagine. I don't know what you think, Amanda.
Well, I was thinking, building on that as well, I think one of the strengths of Recoil is that there's actually what I see as 3 pillars of support. So there's the Recoil research team that obviously worked on putting Recoil together, putting the outcome measure together with all the clinicians, academics and patients involved. The other team is the Recoil implementation team, which is basically Lizzie and me in support. And then we've got the Recoil license team, which is led by the University of Oxford Innovation, who actually, they're the ones that are responsible for working with NHS trusts and those that want to actually hold a license. So I think those 3 pillars of support have been great because we've been able to work with one another. So for example, the Recoil license team have actually gone out and they've identified that Recoil actually needs to be translated into, other than English, other languages. So at the moment, it's translated into 12 languages. Portuguese is currently in development. And not just English, it's English for US as well, because obviously the US have picked this up. But then in terms of the research team, we've obviously gone back to the research team and said, trusts are asking, can we adapt Recoil? How can we use Recoil with those with learning difficulties that need to access mental health services? For example, people with autism. And then we've gone back ourselves as the implementation team. And then we've suggested, well, how can we use how can we use Recoil during COVID when we're not doing face-to-face sessions with patients, and we're needing to ask questions via the phone and via video, and what guidance can we offer? So I think as 3 distinct teams, I think we've come together as a multidisciplinary team, and we've worked extremely well, and I think that's one of the strengths of Recoil. So as Lizzie said, if Lizzie and I weren't here tomorrow, there's such a huge solid foundation behind Recoil that it will continue. And as Lizzie's pointed out, there are strengths and weaknesses in that. I think these 3 pillars of support, the team, the implementation team, and the license team, the research team, implementation and license team, are quite unique, really, I think, to the way in which we've been able to implement Recoil.
And the other pillar of support, if I can put another one in, is some of the really innovative clinicians around the country that we've learned from. So we've developed an online tool that can visualise the Recoil themes as bubbles that get bigger as somebody's quality of life improves. That was a direct idea from the team in Berkshire, that they'd already done it, and that was talked about at one of our events, and everyone was like, oh, we want a bit of that. So we took it and grew it. There was some really innovative work going on in the Black Country about organising all the services around the CHIME framework, which is a recovery framework, which Recoil sort of tessellates with really well. So I think part of what we're now doing is just highlighting these examples of best practice, which inspire other organisations and give them ideas. So yeah, I would say that our community of practice is also our fourth pillar of support, really, because that's where we're now getting our inspiration and our ideas about best practice from.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Lizzie.
So you've got something which, as I say, just to quickly kind of summarize, really robust evidence-based. Then you've got an implementation team, which is you two, and you've really worked hard at promoting it, getting it known, and that a huge aspect of also of co-production by working with clinicians, working with service users to create this. And then what's actually happened over time is that the teamwork and communications remained in place. So you've got the licensing team and the research team, and you are still communicating and working together, and you're still communicating and working with clinicians. I do know that, there's a lot of things that get rolled out where the research team will move on to something else and actually not communicate with whoever's rolling it out anymore. And that just is the way that it generally goes. So I think you might be right. This is quite unusual what you've achieved and what's happened here. Perhaps the next question might be, what did you do wrong?
So I think nationally, that's a harder answer that's a harder question to answer than perhaps if in individual trusts. Sometimes it has felt relatively easy, whereas in other trusts it hasn't felt so easy. So I think it would be easier to answer that question like on a case-by-case basis rather than,
of course,
nationally. Yeah, and I would also say that it's not a case that one trust goes great and then this one, but actually one trust might have a little renaissance time when they've got the right person in post, the right agenda at a strategic level, the right priorities, and Recoil will fly. And then priorities will shift, and that person will move on because their secondment's ended or because they're needed elsewhere. Probably if you went back to those trusts and said, how does Recoil implementation look now compared to 2 years ago, you would find a different story. So I think, yeah, I mean, within each trust, there would be a lot of learning about what went well and what didn't go well and what the barriers and facilitators were. And I think, obviously, so what have we done wrong nationally? We haven't captured that yet. We haven't actually... We've tried to produce some learning we've published about the community of practice, but have we been able to actually say exactly what has worked in trusts and what hasn't? Have we been able to capture that yet? I don't think we have.
Well, and it's clear you're talking as someone who has experience of doing implementation, because you've raised the point from that question that it's context specific. So every context has its own issues. Every context goes through changes. Do you think it's down to a team like yourself to help trusts when things get difficult, to help them overcome those problems? Is there an opportunity for that, or is it more that they have to kind of learn themselves?
It's very difficult, and one of the things I've found difficult is that challenge between am I an insider or am I an outsider? So usually I come into a trust completely as an outsider, and I can't, I'm given the person I'm working with. I can't say, oh, I only want to work with somebody who sits on the strategy board. I can't say that. If I'm given, if the person they've assigned to Recoil doesn't have that level of influence in the organisation, that's not for me to challenge, really. I can advocate, I can advise. So, yeah, sometimes it's about sort of being with the clinicians in their frustration that they want to, for example, get an app put into their electronic patient record system so that it can be used as they want to use it, but that they haven't got the clout to push that up the priority list of the IT department or whatever.
Yes.
So yeah, I think as a kind of somebody in the university that's helping trusts, I'm very much an outsider, so I don't have that. I don't have any power to change the infrastructure that could. I can advise, but I can't change, and that you have to just reflect that back to the organisation, I think.
I think, and you were talking before, we had a conversation previously about this, and about how one thing that, as you just mentioned there, clinicians would really like Recoil to go directly into the electronic patient record, but every trust, well, not every trust, but most trusts can have different systems actually running that, so that they're not all under the same system. They use different ones, which means you need somebody who understands that system to then allow that to happen. And as you said, you don't have direct links with the IT, and the clinicians can't persuade them to make it the priority all the time. So is that a problem you're facing at the moment to try? I think you mentioned COVID as well, and maybe if it could be done on an iPad or something like electronically that way, it might actually make it easier. And so I guess, is this a sort of barrier at the moment that you're facing?
Yeah, I mean, when you said, like, how have we failed? Did you say that?
Well, I mean, I probably didn't phrase it very nicely. I could have said, "Is there anything you could have done better?" You know,
but actually, I'm going to answer the how.
We have failed in some things.
Yeah, just to answer the how have we failed question. The second service user event that we had, we were asked, what we really want is a service user facing app where they can complete the complete Recoil, they can keep a copy for themselves, but equally so that can go into the patient record. Now, what I found so we tried, you know, but finance, obviously, because we don't have much funding, so there would be a cost. But even without the cost, where do you store that data? Which side of the NHS firewall? And how can we create an app that will work with Care Notes, with Paris, with Rio, with System 1? These are all the different electronic patient record systems that our community of practice members work with. So it's like that has been a failure. That was clearly what was wanted. And we've not been able to do it for lack of money, but also because of the infrastructure of the NHS, which has all these different patient reporting, electronic patient reporting systems. So that has, it has been. We've done a workaround. We've created an online tool that can do the data visualization, but that just doesn't store the data. So if a service user wants to compare their progress over time, they can look at the bubbles growing, but only by printing out and keeping the PDFs themselves and looking over time.
Yes.
So yeah, that's been a frustration, and I think to some extent we just haven't managed to do what almost everybody has wanted. Almost everybody has wanted a patient-facing app that can link into the patient record system.
I suppose we can turn that round to a positive though, can't we, Lizzie? Because what we can say is that although we've developed the visualization tool, and that's been developed by ourselves with support from our learning technologists, which by the way, is not an easy thing to do. Because naively, when we set off, we thought we could create this tool. Oh, it'll only take a couple of weeks. And actually, no, you're talking about probably 9 to 12 months, possibly even more when you put testing into the frame. But as Lizzie says, there are ways we can get around this, or not get around it, but there are ways that we can look at it slightly differently. So although we have this tool, we can. And this is one of the implications of implementation, is because we're looking at it trust by trust. At the moment, we're having to work with each individual trust to see who can actually take on and use this visualization tool. So if we can get one of these trusts or a couple of these trusts to use the tool, and then for them to embed that within their care, patient care notes, whether it's System 1, then we can get the NHS Trust to push the actual electronic patient record suppliers to maybe to think, well, hang on a minute, that trust needs it, so there are other trusts that we work with that potentially will want to use Recoil. So let's see. So we're trying to push it upwards. So rather than getting in with the suppliers, which Liz has tried to do, we'll do it from the trusts upwards.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to be clear, a lot of the electronic patient record systems will have a Recoil form in, but usually the service user would complete it on a piece of paper, and then the clinician would take the results and input it. So they're there, but not in a user-friendly, service user-facing way. And they also don't generally produce nice, non-technical visualizations.
I see. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it really captures how difficult implementation can be, because even when you've got as far as you have and you have all this support and all this interest, and as you said, everybody pretty much wanted it to kind of go into the patient record systems, you've come up against quite a big barrier, which is the system itself, really. And then you're now finding ways around that, which is very interesting. How do you see things going forward from this point on?
So our community of practice is still there.
Yeah.
You asked what would happen if Amanda and I disappeared, and that is a thought that we have. So in a way, we would like it to become self-supporting. However, I think the issue of organisational churn really brings that into question, because if people are only given a role for 2-3 years to lead on implementation of PROMs, it's unlikely to be implementation of Recoil, but they would probably, somebody might be given a brief to increase the quality of data collected in their organisation. But if they're only in that post for 2 years, say, or if that post is even only funded for 2 years, we're not ever going to get to the point of the community of practice being self-sustaining, because it's too much of a rolling group. So yeah, where does it go? As long as we're here and we can keep like picking up, you know, kind of catching the transfers and engaging with the new person, that, you know, that the community of practice will keep going, and we will have more events. We want more we particularly would like the next one to be service user focused, because the strength of Recoil was it was developed with service users. It's about putting the things that matter to service users at the heart of our services. So we would like to our next event to really focus on service users and to bring more service users into our community of practice. And I guess that could provide the continuity, because whilst clinicians and jobs will move on, maybe service users will have more longevity about wanting to. This is, you know, we track our paces, don't we? We notice how much walking we've done. Maybe there will be a sort of community of practice of people that just want a tool that helpfully monitors their quality of life, and that is useful in that way. So that's one direction we might go in. I don't know if you have other thoughts, Amanda.
It just goes back to, as you were saying, Lizzie, about the tool, the visualization tool. Obviously we're trialing that and testing it with 2 NHS trusts, but you know, we know from just anecdotal evidence that it is a tool that's wanted. So we really want the next push for us, really, and obviously another workshop, is to see how many other trusts will take it on board and really push for suppliers to look at producing an app or producing it in electronic form so that it links directly with patient records. That's something that we want to keep pushing.
So that was Amanda and Lizzie talking about Recoil. If you want more information on Recoil, I will put some links below. We hope to see you in the next podcast, and we hope you enjoyed this one. Thank you.